All right, good evening, everybody. How are you?
Fine, Emily.
Oh, thank you. Great. Well, we're so happy that you guys are here. My name is Emily Kropczewski. I'm the site manager here at the Heritage Center. We're open Tuesday through Saturday from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. So feel free to stop by and visit anytime. We have a few quick announcements. If anyone on Zoom wouldn't mind, welcome to you, by the way, Zoom people. If you wouldn't mind just making sure you're muted, that would be very helpful. And for those of you in the audience, if you don't mind just silencing your cell phones, take a second to check that. That would be very appreciated. We have a few more programs coming up. One of the ones that I want to mention though, that is very, very exciting is our Stillwater Historic House Tour. That's coming up on May 21st, and it's going to be from 12 p.m. to 5 p.m. We just launched the tickets today on our website, so feel free to go to wchsmn.org and buy your tickets for that. And yeah, that's pretty much it for my announcements. To intro our fabulous guest speaker tonight, we have Chris Gehrz, PhD, Yale. Let's take a second to appreciate that. He is a professor of history at Bethel University, where he teaches courses on modern European military/diplomatic, religious, and sports history. He is the author or editor of 5 books, including Charles Lindbergh, a religious biography of America's most infamous pilot, and writes weekly about history, religion, and education at Substack. He's actually a native of Stillwater, which is wonderful. And he now lives in Roseville with his wife and 2 children. He also has books for sale up here, so come up and feel free to get one of those afterwards. And if you're really nice to you, or if you're really nice to him, he might sign it for you too. So without further ado, here is Chris Gehrz.
I'll sign the evening if you're not nice. Thank you for having me. As Emily said, I'm a native of Stillwater, so any chance to come back to my favorite city is great. I did most of my teenage growing up just north of town in the township, so it's been great to be back here. I was really hoping to be a blizzard in cold weather outside, but very nice. So thank you for coming inside in beautiful weather for a history talk tonight. There are a lot of other things you could have done. Twins are winning 11-0 over the Yankees, and yet you're other than that, I'll try not to pay attention to baseball and pay attention to our topic tonight, which is seeing Minnesota history through the life of Charles A. Lindbergh. So this book came out 2 years ago, 2021. It's in a series of religious biographies. I'll say just a little bit about religion, although that's not really my focus tonight. But I'll say a little bit about why I wrote that book, why it has the focus that it does as we go. But before we get started, I just thought I'd ask a broader question of you all, which is why do we read biographies? And for that matter, why do people like me write biographies? What is the purpose of these kinds of biographies? Why are they popular? Most history books don't sell very well. This one hasn't sold great, but why do biographies tend to do very well? What's so appealing about them? Right. The purpose. Yeah, I mean, usually these are compelling people in some sort. So what kinds of people make for good biography subjects usually, would you say?
Controversial.
Oh, controversial, right? You might have noticed that my publisher called this an infamous pilot, right? We're going to talk about that. Yeah, controversial figures.
Accomplished
In some way, right? Yeah, they often tend to be presidents or popular. Historical figures of some sort, yeah. I taught a class actually here at First Presbyterian Church about Lindbergh last fall, and we talked about this. And I asked this question, and the first answer that I got was someone said because they're inspiring, right? They're usually accomplished people and significant, interesting people because they are especially good at something, they're charismatic, they're a great speaker, they put their thumbprint on history. And then I looked at my subject and thought, well, I think there are inspiring aspects of this story. Flying across an ocean by yourself in 33 hours in 1927 is still an inspiring feat. There are other parts of his story, though, that are not especially inspiring and are pretty troubling. And we'll touch on some of those. And for that matter, I thought of my bookshelf in my office, and I have biographies of people like Mao Zedong, Joseph Stalin, Adolf Hitler, Napoleon. Not always. Sometimes we read biographies because they're such troubling figures, right? But the second thing that someone said at that class that I thought a lot about and inspired this talk is that sometimes biographies are a good way to get into history. Sometimes it's very hard to pick up a very academic looking book about the past. Sometimes it's easier to enter the past through the experience of one person. And so that was my goal for tonight. I thought, I'm not sure what connection Charles Lindbergh has to Washington County or Stillwater, But this is the gateway to Minnesota. This is maybe a birthplace of Minnesota. And I think one thing we can do tonight is use Charles Lindbergh, a particularly famous or infamous Minnesotan, to better understand the story of our state, or the story of Minnesota. I'm born and raised Minnesotan. I was out east for 10 years getting educated, and I've been back now for over 20 years. So we'll start in Stillwater. So this is a map of Minnesota territory. Notice that it still includes part of the Dakotas. They'll get cut off in 1858, but our story starts in 1848, right? When in the downtown of a logging site called Stillwater, Minnesota, there's a convention that gathers to request that Minnesota be organized as a territory. So we'll talk a little bit about what it was before the territory on the next, in just a minute, but this gets the ball rolling. That petition is granted a year later. In 1849, Minnesota is organized, gets a governor, and 9 years later, we get Minnesota statehood. All right, so Minnesota enters this 32nd state, and just in time to send some volunteers off to die in places like Gettysburg, the American Civil War. So that's Minnesota statehood, right? Now, Minnesota grows significantly in this just 10-year period. In the 1850 census, there are only 6,000 Minnesotans in the territory. By the 1860 census, the number is almost 30 times greater. In 3 of those 175,000 some Minnesotans have just arrived from Europe. Their names are Ola, Louisa, and Carl August, or C.A. Monson. So let me tell you their story. Ola Monson was born in 1808 in Skåne province, was a farmer, but also a politician. He was a member of the Swedish parliament, the Riksdag. But suddenly, in the summer of 1859, he took his wife and infant child, put them on a boat, and 10 weeks later, they settled a homestead in the little village of Melrose, Minnesota. This is kind of between Sauk Center and St. Cloud, out in kind of central Minnesota. Yeah, if you want, in Q&A, I can tell you more of the story of Ola Monson and why he did this. I'll just tell you 2 things. First of all, it wasn't for the usual reasons that Swedes came to Minnesota. It wasn't for economic opportunity.
I'm so sorry.
Okay. It wasn't for economic opportunity, unlike my Peterson and Nelson and Anderson and Larson ancestors, my mom's side. It wasn't for religious freedom, like the Baptists who founded Bethel. It was for something else. And the hint here is that he changed his name as soon as he got here. Ola Monson became August Lindbergh. And his infant son was Charles August Lindbergh. Well, we'll call him CA for the rest of this talk. So here's what they look like as the family grew. They had 3 more kids. This is from about 1876. See, August is seated with a beard. Louisa is seated with a little child in her lap. And then the strapping young lad, the teenager behind them, is CA Charles August. So they're a somewhat prosperous family. They have a good farm in Melrose. They can send Charles August to a private college preparatory school run by a Catholic priest. And from there, this young man goes off to Michigan. He goes to law school at the University of Michigan, graduates, and comes back to Minnesota and sets up his law practice in a little logging town called Little Falls up the Mississippi River in 1883. Does well for himself, gets married, has 2 daughters. His first wife dies. He remarries a woman, a science teacher from Detroit, Michigan, named Evangeline Lodge Land. And in February of 1902, they have their first and only child, and they name him Charles Augustus. So you can't quite call him C.A. Jr. So you call him Charles and his father C.A. But this is the famous pilot with his mother. And then here he is at age 8 with his father. So that's Charles and then C.A. C.A. at this point is not just a prosperous lawyer, but in the middle of his 10-year term as a US congressman from Minnesota. He's a progressive Republican. So young Charles Lindbergh spent his childhood bouncing around Little Falls, Detroit, and then also Washington, D.C. for parts of the year, which meant he had a very itinerant education. He did not do well in school. I graduated from high school in 1918, went off to the University of Wisconsin and flunked out and went to Nebraska to learn how to become a pilot. And I'll put his story on hold at that point, because I think most of us know what comes in 1927. So we'll get there. Okay, so here's Charles Lindbergh, a little bit about Minnesota. What I'd like to do then, using the story of this Minnesotan's life, is to pull out maybe 6 themes from Minnesota history. And I'll try to use the words of Charles Lindbergh as much as I can, and a few other things, and we'll kind of take a tour of Minnesota history in the process. So here's the first theme. It should be familiar. I got a sense of this even walking through the exhibit just before we started, right? Because at one point, this was the frontier, Stillwater. Little Falls certainly was the frontier when it was founded in 1848. It was a tiny little village on Mississippi River. To the west was Ojibwe land, to the east was Dakota land, right? That's the frontier. And I think it's hard for us to imagine that in the mid 19th century, Minnesota felt like what the Wild West will feel like in the late 19th century. And that's already starting to change when the Lindberghs or the Monsons arrive, right? Native Americans are being pushed off into reservations or further to the west or to the south. We've got towns coming up. And by 1890, this is what Little Falls looked like. And then it got really big because then the logging industry took off. So Little Falls, when Charles Lindbergh is born, is part of a pretty complicated logging industry, which is not too dissimilar from Stillwater's story. Right, so it's on the Mississippi River, so you've got timber way up north by places like Grand Rapids being felled by these woodsmen, put it down the river, and it winds up here. And we can't really see it in this picture, but they built a huge sawmill right at the kind of point in the river where the river pauses. And so this is the main thing that keeps Little Falls afloat, is generating timber for houses, not just these houses, but further down the river in fast-growing cities like Minneapolis, St. Paul, and beyond. And so that's the world that Charles Lindbergh is born into. It was something that used to be the frontier. It is no longer the frontier. So at the end of his life, Charles Lindbergh started to write a long, meandering autobiography. And it was edited after he died and then published in 1978. And here's one of his reflections on growing up at this point in Minnesota history. He said, "The frontier was gone by the time I was born in 1902. Indians had been assigned reservations, horses replaced oxen, forests were disappearing. Men hunted with breech-loading guns. Houses were built of lumber, not logs. Towns and villages dotted the map of Minnesota. More than 4,000 people lived in the village of Little Falls, etc. My father hired men to run the farm we lived on. My mother kept a cook, a nurse, and a maid. Civilization, as European Americans would think of it, had come to Little Falls. It was the 20th century. The frontier was this lost age that there were kind of hints of, but it was gone. And the tone here, I think, is wistful. There's a little bit of Charles Lindbergh that wishes he had been born earlier, that wishes he had been alive in his grandfather's age, right, when there was a different kind of experience. This is the point in Charles Lindbergh's life when he has really started to turn his back on technology. We're going to talk more about this at the other end of the talk. But this is the point of his life when he wants to embrace nature, when he's interested in indigenous peoples around the world, and he's trying to go into the wilderness. He wishes that's what was still true. But of course, that's not what Charles Lindbergh is famous for, right? Charles Lindbergh is mostly famous, before we get to the infamous stuff, for aviation, right? For one of the signature achievements of technological development in the 20th century, and for pushing the airplane to do something we now take for granted, connecting continents and crossing oceans. I mean, Charles Lindbergh helps build a global economy, in a sense. The air routes that you take if you fly to France or England are air routes that he scouted in the 1930s, right? And so in that sense, let me talk about the idea of the closed frontier. So in 1890, the US Census announced that the frontier was gone. And what they meant was that all that land, the west of Mississippi, had been organized, it was increasingly urbanized, it was being industrialized, it was being governed. 1890 is the year of the Wounded Knee Massacre and the last gasp of the frontier wars against Native Americans. And that's the end of the frontier. And 3 years later, a historian named Frederick Jackson Turner, speaking at the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, gave a talk on the frontier in American history. And so he kind of gave a story of the frontier. And what he said is that the frontier had been the key force in American history. It was not just the place where kind of the excess population went to find land and to start new lives. It was the place where creativity happened. It was the place where energy went. It was the place where innovation took place. It was the place where America reinvented itself in Turner's mind. And that was the history, but what he was trying to suggest is, and now what? What comes once the frontier is closed? Where is that excess population going to go? Where is the innovation going to take place? Where is the creativity? Where is the energy going to happen? And so, like, one way of thinking about 20th century history is the search for a new frontier. It's not going to be territory in the West. So what is it going to be? So maybe the most famous example of this comes from a Massachusetts senator running for president in 1960. John F. Kennedy talked about what he called the new frontier, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils. Beyond that frontier, uncharted areas of science and space, unsolved problems of peace and war, unconquered problems of ignorance and prejudice, unanswered questions of poverty and surplus. I'm asking each of you to be pioneers towards that new frontier. We carry through in an age where we will witness not only new breakthroughs and weapons of destruction, but also a race for mastery of the sky and the rain, the ocean and the tides, the far side of space and the inside of men's minds. So in a sense, the new frontier became knowledge and invention and innovation and research, and maybe flying across an ocean, pushing a machine to do things we didn't think it could do. This is the Lindbergh Memorial on the State Capitol Mall in St. Paul. This was installed in the mid-1980s, and it's two sculptures. The little one is the boy, Charles Lindbergh, around 1910. He's just seen his first airplane, a tiny little rickety airplane flying over Little Falls, and he's dreaming of being a bird. And then there's the 25-year-old man who flew across the ocean in May of 1927. And I think this is a way of thinking about the new frontier, right? Like this is someone who couldn't grow up on the old frontier, and so the sky became the new frontier. Doing something that no one thought was possible became the new frontier. And in a sense, that's been a very Minnesotan story in the 20th century. Think about the role that the University of Minnesota plays in not just Minnesota, but American society. Its tagline these days is driven to discover. It's an engine of innovation, of research, of finding new breakthroughs. My dad was a medical researcher at U for a long time, right? So in healthcare, in engineering, in agriculture, in farming and all these things. And then think about other famous companies in Minnesota, right? Think about Medtronic, right? Think about 3M, think about Honeywell. Think about Minnesota as this kind of center of innovation, of discovery and development. This is the new frontier idea. This is what you do when the old frontier closes. You turn that energy into things like science and technology, or think about how Minnesota has often been this somewhat progressive state, early to address issues of poverty, often a pioneer in education. That's a way of thinking about the new frontier in Minnesota that Lindbergh represents. But let me go back to what he said about Little Falls. So I skipped over the yellow passage here, right? When places like Stillwater and Little Falls were first being founded, the very first people who came to Minnesota, for the most part, came from New England. It's Yankees who come out to Minnesota, right? Now there are a few Swedes in places like Taylor's Falls, Chisago County, right? But it's mostly people from New England. But especially after the Civil War, that starts to change. Little Falls includes those Yankees, but it also includes a lot of Scandinavians and Central Europeans. But here's, not surprisingly, theme number 2, Minnesota is a land of immigrants. Right? It's a pretty familiar story. My guess is we could take the rest of the hour, and a lot of you could probably tell stories of this if you're from Minnesota. I've already alluded to my Swedish immigrant ancestors who came to Minnesota. So back to 1890. The census declares the frontier is closed, and the census also asks, in what country were you born, or were your parents born? In Minnesota in 1890, 40% of adults said that they had actually been born in another country. Now, this is a high watermark in immigration in the United States, right? This is an age when immigration is an all-time high, coming from around the world, but especially from Europe, including Southern Europe, Italian immigration happening. Nationwide, that number was about 10%. Minnesota has 4 times as many immigrants as the rest of the country. And specifically, they're coming from 3 places. By the 1900 census, 60% of foreign-born population in this state came from Germany, Norway, and Sweden. And so here we can connect back to the Lindbergh story, right? So between 1850 and 1930, 1.25 million Swedes came to the United States. 20% of them settled in this state, including the 3 Monsons / the 3 Lindberghs settled in this state. And so the Lindbergh story is a story of immigrants. He's the son of immigrants, but his father was a young immigrant who had to make his way in a new society. And I think this is a story that a lot of immigrants tell, but the Swedish version of this story is often a tension, right? On the one hand, Swedish immigrants who come to places like Minnesota maintain connections to the mother country. They write letters back and forth. Sometimes they even go back to the mother country, at least before World War I starts. They keep speaking the same language. They keep eating the same food. To this day, once a year, I have to eat Ludovic, right? I actually have a costume. I sing in Swedish singers at my church once in a while, right? Like that is still there. This kind of like maintain the old ways, but the other force is adapt to the new world, learn English, pick up the mores of this culture, figure out how your kids can get ahead in this culture, maybe assimilate to some extent. And those are always in tension with each other. And this is true for Swedes as well. And a kind of moment where you can see this, and there's a Lindbergh connection here, is in 1918. So in 1914, the world goes to war, but the United States stays out of it, Sweden stays out of it the whole time. And finally, in 1917, the United States gets sucked into World War I. I should tell you now, C.A. Lindbergh, Charles Lindbergh's father, had just ended his tour in Congress. He ran for Senate in 1916, lost the Republican primary. And so he was there long enough to cast a vote in March 1917 against arming American merchant ships against U-boats. But then he left, and in April, the US Congress declared war. Half of the Minnesota representatives voted against that declaration. Anyone who represented a German or a Scandinavian district voted against the declaration of war. In Wisconsin, it was 9 out of 11 voted against the war. C.A. Lindbergh decided to run for governor the next year, and he ran on an anti-war campaign. He published a book that alleged that World War I was a rich man's war and poor man's fight. It was a Wall Street war. It was going to chew up the lives of working Minnesotans, of farmers, of other working class people. In that sense, he spoke for a lot of Swedes. Before 1917, most Minnesotan Swedish Americans, Norwegian Americans, certainly German Americans did not want the United States to enter World War I. Said it has nothing to do with us. In any case, if we're going to support anyone, we would support Germany. Swedes felt much more affinity for Germany, right? They were connected culturally, they're both Lutheran countries to some extent. And Germany's chief enemy, besides England and France, was Russia, which is the historic foe and rival of the Swedes. So for a long time, Swedes were neutrals. They were Republicans who did not want to go to war. And C.A. Lindbergh represents that point of view, but he's running against another Republican, another Swedish American who has the opposite point of view. His name is J.A.A. Bernquist. He is staunchly pro-war. He almost literally drapes himself in the flag in that campaign. Here's one of his posters. It says, Bernquist for governor, keep the party loyal. And he crushes C.A. Lindbergh in the primary and wins election in 1918. If you're interested in this, one of the books I put on the backside of your handout is by a journalist named Kurt Brown. It's about 1918 as a kind of pivotal year in Minnesota history. It talks about the Spanish flu, it talks about the famous forest fires, and it talks about this governor's race. So you can learn more there. Bernquist is most famous then for once he's elected governor, he establishes a state commission of public safety whose job is to investigate disloyal Minnesotans. Most famously, University of Minnesota professors and the town government of New Ulm, Minnesota, a German enclave that was suspected of being full of sedition, right? And so there's a kind of tension, right? You know, this sort of traditional neutrality, affinity for Germany versus we have to demonstrate that we are patriotic Americans, right? We have to go out of our way to prove that we are loyal, and Bernquist wins out. One other version of this back in Little Falls, this is the Swedish Lutheran Church in Little Falls. This is the old location. They moved down the street a few years ago. It's called Bethel Evangelical Lutheran Church. This was the Augustana Synod Church where the Swedes went. And they did not do any worship in English until World War I. And they felt maybe they ought to do some things in English to show that they are good, assimilated, patriotic Americans, unlike their German cousins. And this brings up theme number 3. Religion in Minnesota is not just about Lutherans. Now, I say this in jest because I go to a Lutheran church. I married a Lutheran daughter of a Lutheran pastor. But while that's a big part of Minnesota's religious history, that's not all there is. And the Lindbergh story demonstrates this. So in Little Falls, during Charles Lindbergh's life, there were 2 Lutheran churches, one for the Swedes, one for the Norwegians, which is a very common theme in Minnesota Lutheran history. There was also a Swedish-speaking Mission Covenant Church. I mentioned that because that was my denomination growing up. I was confirmed at Bethany Covenant over by Target. But here's what's interesting. The Lindberghs did not attend either of the Swedish-speaking churches. They went to First Congregational Church in downtown Little Falls. There was a very practical reason for that. None of the Lindberghs spoke Swedish. They would not have had any idea what was happening in worship if they had gone to that church, right? Instead, they went to the English-speaking church, the church that descends from New England Puritans. That's what Congregationalism is. It's what's left of the Puritans from Massachusetts. It was founded by missionaries from New England who came to Minnesota right before the Civil War, both to convert Native Americans and to keep European settlers from losing their faith. That's where that church came from. And this is where the elites have come. This is where the people who owned the lumber mill went to church. And so that's where the Lindbergh family went to church. When Charles Lindbergh writes about this, he is fairly suspicious. He says they didn't really go all that often. He says his father only went because he was campaigning for office and needed to show people that he was devout. And he really didn't like it. And Lindbergh said that as a little boy, he hated going to church, which is not an unusual story for 6-year-old boys throughout church history. He said he'd rather be swimming in the Mississippi or off hunting or something, but instead he had to sit down in this uncomfortable church. And so he grew up largely without a whole lot of religious education. His parents didn't care that much. His mom read in the Bible and then told him, now you know this is false. Right? Like that was his kind of religious upbringing. But here's where it gets interesting. C.A. Lindbergh actually did start going to church. Late in life, before he died of cancer in 1924, he
I
was going
gained
to
2 pounds
the Unitarian
yesterday.
Society in Minneapolis. Whose pastor was the Prof pastor
right?
from Pennsylvania, who supported evolution. Right, that's who Charles Lindbergh's father. He thought, yeah, I kind of like that kind of religion. Right? And here's my story. This is really what the biography I wrote is about. Charles Lindbergh, up until about the mid-1930s, has no interest in anything related to religion, spirituality, the supernatural, but for the second half of his life, that's arguably his primary interest. So I thought it'd be interesting to write a biography of someone who is not religious, very spiritually interested. In the second half of his life, for example, for about 20 years, his favorite person was Jesus. And he hated Christianity. He dabbled in Eastern religions. He studied Hindu mystics in Calcutta in 1937. He visited Buddhist temples. And his wife was even more interested. And at the end of his life, he spent a lot of time in places like Kenya and Tonga and the Philippines studying indigenous persons and their beliefs. And through them, he encountered what's called pantheism, which is the idea that God is present in everything and everyone. God is present in a mountain, God is present in a tree, in water, in a volcano, and in each of us. At the end of his life, Charles Lindbergh's idea is that when you die, your body joins the divine life stream. And you get reabsorbed into this kind of divine consciousness, right? That's Charles Lindbergh's belief system at the end of his life. So I mention that because Minnesota religion is much more diverse than you might tend to think. If you have a kind of Garrison-Keillor notion of Minnesota, you think it's Lutherans, and then you might know that Catholics are the other really big population. But even now, it's much more diverse. So in 2015, the Pew Research Center, which is a nonpartisan group that studies religion and politics especially, issued its second religious landscape survey. So they talked about 30,000 Americans about religion. In the state of Minnesota, they found that the religious pie basically has 5 equal pieces. About 20% of Minnesotans are Lutheran. In the most recent religion census I saw, it's actually down to about 16%, but still Minnesota is the 3rd most Lutheran proportional state next to the 2 Dakotas. About 20% are Catholic, that's still true. About 20% are evangelical Protestants. They go to Baptist megachurches like Eaglebrook or Wooddale. They go to Pentecostal churches, and a lot go to non-denominational churches. I'm going to skip over this one for a second. And then 20% are everything else, which is everyone from Methodist, Jehovah's Witnesses, to Ethiopian Orthodox, to 5% of Minnesotans follow other religions of the world, like Judaism or Hinduism, or most numerously, Islam. In most recent religion census, 2% of Minnesotans are Muslim, mostly because of Somali migration. That makes Minnesota proportionally the 6th most Muslim state in the country. Right, so if your notion of Minnesota is a bunch of Scandinavian Lutherans, German and Irish Catholics, that is part of the story, but it's actually much more diverse. And here, especially, think about that unaffiliated group. This is the fastest growing part of the Minnesotan population. It's actually probably closer to 25 to 30% now. It's gone up about 10 points in the last 10 years or so. So these are people who are committed atheists, agnostics, but mostly it's people who say that they are spiritual, but not religious. They believe in God. They think there's something beyond this world. They pray, right? They believe in mystical experience. They just don't really want to belong to a church. They don't think that any religion has monopoly on truth, on God. This is the Charles Lindbergh story. This is actually why I wanted to write the Lindbergh biography, is that I work at a Christian college, I go to a Lutheran church, and I wanted to understand that 20% a little bit better through the story of a very famously spiritual but not religious Minnesotan. And so if you're really interested in that side, that's actually the big theme of the book. It's only part of it. Okay, now we're going to transition to the infamous part of the Lindbergh story. So you might be sitting there wondering, so why did Charles Lindbergh suddenly get interested in spirituality? Why was he studying Hindu mystics and visiting Buddhist temples and reading the New Testament? So a couple of things happened. One is that he got married to a woman named Anne Morrow, an ambassador's daughter, who in her own words was a lapsed Presbyterian. She introduced him to a lot of new reading material. But more importantly, in 1930, Charles Lindbergh had lunch with a French scientist named Alexis Carrel. So Carrel is, I don't think, very well known anymore, but in his day, he was very famous. He was a Nobel Prize winner for medicine. He was a pioneer in surgery, especially. And he worked at the Rockefeller Institute in New York, and he was a pioneer in organ transplant surgery. Charles Lindbergh, by 1930, was bored with flying and decided he wanted to study biology, even though he was a college dropout who had never liked science. And he hooked up with Carrel, and they actually wrote journal articles together, and Lindbergh helped him invent a pump that would keep tissue alive while a doctor was working on it. So he actually facilitates breakthroughs in organ transplant surgery with Carrel. That's the first thing Alexis Carrel is known for. The second, Alexis Carrel is a Catholic mystic. Very idiosyncratic, very unorthodox, very suspicious of the Catholic Church, but very interested in Lourdes, the site in France associated with miraculous healing. And believed that God communicates through visions. God reveals himself to people. God does supernatural healing. And as a scientist, he thought he should study that. And so especially in the last 20 years of his life, Carrel was really interested in supernatural experience. And he encouraged Charles Lindbergh to look into supernatural experience. But the third thing that Alexis Carrel is known for is he was a prominent supporter of something called eugenics. I haven't heard of eugenics before. So I want to take a shot. What is eugenics?
Improving race, basically.
Yeah, improving the race, right? So this starts in the late 19th century, and in some ways comes out of Darwinian biology. But it's viewed as science at the time, right? That there are ways that we can use different techniques to improve the human species. For example, in 1935, Alexis Carrel published a best-selling book called Man the Unknown. It's almost unreadable. I have no idea why so many people bought it, but he tapped into this fear that humanity was declining, right? His words, degenerating. And so he said, what we need to do is figure out how to improve the species, how to turn around the decline of humanity. And he had a couple of ideas. One was what's called negative eugenics, right? He suggested we should probably euthanize murderers, right? We don't need criminals like that polluting the bloodstream. We probably should sterilize other kinds of people who bring down the quality of the species. What he really was interested in was how do we improve the best of the species? He had an idea for a whole institute of man that was going to be dedicated to the best and the brightest and helping them breed. Right? That was Carrel's idea. That's eugenics. And at this point, Charles Lindbergh was living in France in exile after the kidnapping and murder of his son and the press attention that went with that. And they talked about this. Charles Lindbergh never wrote or spoke publicly about this. In his private papers, they're held at Yale. He writes things like this. We must surround ourselves with people who add quality of mind and strength of body to our community, with people whose sons and daughters' blood we are willing to have mixed with the blood of our children. Right? He suggested Carrel be a little bit more cautious in talking about elites versus non-elites, but otherwise he thought Carrel was exactly right. This article that Lindbergh never published was addressed to the best of the species. In it, he said that equality is a false idol. Equality is not a good thing to pursue. People are not actually equal. We should embrace the fact that some people are superior and we should encourage them to reproduce. And he said what we should seek is what he called the quality of life, which was a Carrel phrase. It means the quality of the species. That's what we should encourage. He didn't really give this up. At the end of World War II, right after Carrel died in France, Charles Lindbergh wrote in his diary in April of 1945, this is like 2 days after FDR died. If our policies encourage the reproduction of our less able groups, nothing we do can save our race and civilization. He was worried that the Truman administration would have policies that would encourage the poor and the ignorant to reproduce too much. In the 1950s, Lindbergh was on the board of the National Eugenics Society at the time when it was trying to embrace genetics instead of eugenics. But this is a part of the Lindbergh story, right? He believes in this, and I should say he believes in the superiority of the white race. The other thing that bothered Carell is what he saw as the decline of white people, the encroachment of non-white people. That's part of the story as well. I'll not get into tonight. And so here's a fourth theme you might not have expected to hear in a Minnesota history talk, but eugenics was popular in this state for a period of time. It's primarily thanks to this man. His name is Charles Fremont Dite. He was a medical school professor. He was also a politician in Minneapolis around the time of World War I. Charles Dite was a committed eugenicist. He believed it was the best way to address social problems like poverty and housing shortages and sanitation issues. He said we just had too many of the wrong kind of people, right? And so he lobbied for legislation and institutions that would address this problem, and he was listened to. Even before he showed up in 1917, there was a governor's commission reporting on the serious public menace of what they called mentally subnormal children. And they set up a school for the feeble-minded in Faribault, Minnesota. Started to institutionalize people whose IQ did not reach a certain level. And then, thanks to Dite's lobbying, in 1925, the state legislature passed a law permitting the sterilization of institutionalized Minnesotans, those who were feeble-minded, those who were sexually active, and so this is mostly aimed at young women, and those who were mentally ill. And the argument was like, we should not encourage these people to reproduce. This weakens the quality of life in Minnesota. And this was not unusual. Most American states by the mid-1930s had a law like this on the books, including the state of Virginia, where I went to college and where my parents lived. In the spring of 1927, the Virginia statute came to the Supreme Court. This is like 3 weeks before Lindbergh flies across the ocean. The Supreme Court rules on the case of a woman named Carrie Buck, who had been sterilized. And by an 8-to-1 vote, the Supreme Court says this is totally constitutional. Chief Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes says famously, quote, 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. There was one dissenting vote. There's a Minnesotan named Pierce Butler. If you're ever in St. Paul and take Pierce Butler Drive, that's what his name for. Pierce Butler voted against this because he was a devout Catholic, and the Catholic Church had argued quite strenuously against eugenics. Holmes actually criticized Pierce Butler for letting religion influence his views, right? Catholics, for the most part, oppose this. Protestants, for the most part, support eugenics. This is from a Mother's Day sermon in 1926 by the rector of St. Mark's Episcopal Church in Minneapolis. He said, "We see that the less fit members of society seem to breed fastest, and the right types are less prolific. Until the impurities of dross and alloy are purified out of our silver, it cannot be taken into the hands of the craftsman for whom the refining is done." It's using biblical language to describe the need to purify species, take out the useless material. Right? Over the next 20 years, about 2,000 Minnesotans, almost all of them young women, were sterilized. So that law was actually on the books until the mid-70s, until the year I was born. It was mostly in the first 20 years that this took place. It ended in the 40s for a few reasons. One is social workers changed their mind about it. They decided it was actually doing more damage than good. But also, eugenics by the 1940s was associated not with Charles Dite, not with Charles Darwin, but with other people, the Nazis. So from 1933 to 1939, one thing the Nazi Party did in Germany was to make the case that the purity of the race was the most important problem facing German society. This is a poster from the magazine of the racial office of the Nazi Party called Neues Volk, New People, New Folk. It says it costs 60,000 Reichsmarks a year to maintain this person, someone suffering from some kind of mental illness. And essentially asks people, this is your money. Do you want to spend it on this worthless life? And so the Nazis adopted sterilization laws, just like Americans have. They began to sterilize people who were feeble-minded, were criminal, were of the wrong racial background. And then in 1939, they upped the ante a little bit, and they began to euthanize children who had developmental delays, and then adults. And by the time this campaign ended in the 1940s during World War II, something like 250,000 Germans had been euthanized because of this. It includes people who suffered from depression, autism. I think of my uncle, who's a paranoid schizophrenic. They were often euthanized as well because they were worthless life. They polluted the race, right? So this becomes associated with Hitler, with Nazi atrocities. This is the memorial in Berlin that I saw last summer. It's by the Opera House in Berlin by the Gehrz. But we forget, like, this is actually an American policy. The Germans studied American eugenics laws when they wrote their laws, right? If you've ever seen the movie Judgment in Nuremberg from 1961, this is what it's about. They quote Oliver Wendell Holmes, the same line that I just quoted. Montgomery Clift plays a man who's been sterilized, right? That's actually the story of those Nuremberg files. And this takes us to World War II, right? This is what we were fighting against, right? This was the great evil. This was the great crusade, was to stop people who had this view of human life, who didn't believe in equality. And it's true, 300 Minnesotans fought in that war. About 3% of them died in that war, which is roughly the national average. But here's what I think we tend to forget as Minnesotans, which is that Minnesotans did not want to fight in that war. Minnesota, as much as any other state, was a bastion of what's called isolationism. The belief that the United States should stay behind its oceans and stay out of the affairs of the old world, and especially not get involved in the Second World War. And there are reasons to think this, right? World War I killed 10 to 15 million people. In the 1930s, most Americans felt like the British had suckered us into it, right? Why should we do that? Haven't we learned our lesson? Never again. Whenever I take students to Europe to study World War I, that's what they see on gravestones. Never again, lest we forget. So it's well-intentioned to some extent, but there's also this kind of sense of the rest of the world is not our business. We should go fight great crusades. We should look to our own interests first. And so in the mid-1930s, there's a whole series of neutrality laws that are bipartisan in Congress. This is what's going to make it so hard for Franklin Roosevelt to aid the British and the French when World War II breaks out. It's against the law for the US to send weapons to get involved, right? He's going to have to find ways around them. And some of its leading advocates are Midwestern Southerners, especially Gerald and I in North Dakota, but Henrik Shipstad. For a quarter century, he was a senator from Minnesota who was an isolationist. One of the last things he did before he left office in 1947 was to vote to keep the US out of the United Nations. Henrik Shipstad was a Norwegian American isolationist who thought, we're not going to get another war. We didn't want to get in the First World War. Why are we going to get in the Second World War? He was part of the Farmer Labor Party, by the old one, and then he became a Republican in 1940. Another fun story, there's an article that I put on your sheet here about Henry Nickelmo, another Norwegian American. He was a lawyer from Fergus Falls. He was maybe the most famous lobbyist against intervention in Minnesota. And they were very effective. In the summer of 1941, Gallup did a national survey asking if the United States should get involved in the war. And remember, by the summer of 1941, it's not just the British fighting the Germans, but the Soviets are now fighting, right? The Germans had just invaded Russia, Ukraine, et cetera. 85% of Minnesotans opposed US entry into World War I. This is a few months before Pearl Harbor. Right, so this will turn around quickly, but pretty much right up until the end, most Minnesotans had not been convinced that we ought to be fighting a war against Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. And of course, there's one other good reason for that, which is this is the other thing that Charles Lindbergh is best known for. Right? He is the most famous spokesperson of an anti-intervention group called the America First Committee. It's organized by Yale law students. Lindbergh speaks at Yale in October of 1940. And then he kind of hits the circuit. He speaks in huge arenas like Madison Square Garden, the Hollywood Bowl. And in May of 1941, he comes to Minneapolis and speaks to 12,000 people in the Armory. Henrik Shipstad is right up on stage along with Methodist and Episcopal pastors. And here's what he said. If only we send our armies abroad once more, they tell us. If only enough people in Europe can be starved and killed, we will be able to spread peace and democracy and our way of life with the entire earth. People who have been pacifists all their lives are now saying that peace must be brought by war. Ministers are preaching that Christianity must be spread by famine. We do not accept that claim that Christianity will thrive on famine or that our way of life can be spread around the world by force. Now, I want to say in many respects, Lindbergh doesn't look great from the perspective of history. His wife admitted in her journals that she was wrong. She underestimated the threat that Nazi Germany faced. She did not pay attention to refugees and what they were suffering. And this is not an unfair point, right? The US often struggles. We can export democracy through invasion and conquest, right? Like that is something we should be careful of. But this message resonates with Minnesotans, right? It's very effective. But a few months later, in September of 1941, Lindbergh comes back to the upper Midwest. And on September 11th, 1941, speaks to a crowd in Des Moines, Iowa. It's a similar kind of message, but in this case, he says, the problem is that there are three groups agitating to get the United States into this pointless war. Roosevelt administration, the British, and the Jews. And he said, I don't blame the Jews for thinking this way, but we need to look to our own interests. And our interests are not that. As if American Jews are not Americans, right? And Lindbergh, by the way, warns him again and again, do not say this, right? You can actually read the rough draft of the speech or comments on it in the archive. He goes off, he speaks, it almost implodes the America First Committee. Because the committee had gone out of its way to avoid association with fascists, with anti-Semites. They didn't want to be tarred as just Nazi sympathizers. And Lindbergh undoes all of that. And public opinion really starts to turn around against him at that point. So Pearl Harbor comes, America First shuts down, 300 Minnesotans go off to fight, including one that may surprise you. I'm not sure he's even in the total. But Charles Lindbergh flew 50 combat missions in the South Pacific in the spring and summer of 1944. So technically, he was just testing airplanes for the Marines and the Army, but in the process, he shot down at least one Japanese plane, bombed Japanese positions. Keep in mind, he was 42 years old. He had never seen combat, even though he trained with the Army Air Force in the 1920s. So this is all hush hush. Right? And once word started to get out, Douglas MacArthur sent him back home. And that was the end of it. But Lindbergh actually does end up fighting the war. And in some respects, it's one of the most important experiences of his life. The only book he takes with him is the New Testament. This is when he really starts to read about Jesus. 4 years later, he writes a book about Jesus and other figures. He starts to rethink his racial views. He actually comes away admiring the Japanese. And he's even kind of interested in the indigenous Pacific Islanders he meets. He feels they're closer to nature. They have a simpler life than the one he knew back in Europe and North America. And 8 years later, when he starts writing his autobiography, he thinks back to a day when he decided to go swimming off the coast of New Guinea. And he kind of imagines himself doing this. I float with hands clasped behind my head, stare upward into sky, and become conscious of the sphere called Earth. I take my place, a consciousness of life, under the warm rays of light, amid the coral colors of the sea, near curving trunks of palm on shore, tasting the salt of the ocean's water. And this is the last great theme of Charles Lindbergh's life, the sense that maybe civilization has come with costs. Maybe we've become too dependent on technology. Maybe we've lost touch with the environment. Maybe we're abusing the environment. And he spends the last 15 years of his life advocating for environmental protection, endangered species around the world, forest protection in places like South America and the Philippines. And along with it, the people who live in those places, Pacific Islanders, tribes in Kenya and Tanzania. In 1973, he comes back to Little Falls. The DNR has just created an interpretive center at the state park near their house named for his father. So Charles A. Lindbergh State Park is named for the dad, not for the son. And he gives a speech. And he talks about the importance of establishing parks and nature reserves. And here's part of what he said. With each year that passes, I feel more convinced of the essential need of preserving man's natural environment. I believe our civilization's latest advance is symbolized by the park, rather than by satellites and space travel. In establishing parks and natural reserves, man reaches beyond the material values of science and technology to the miraculous spiritual awareness that only nature and balance can maintain. So this is kind of the last great cause of his life. He dies a year later from lymphoma, and he dies in Hawaii, where they built their last house. He intentionally wanted to pick a remote place with a view of the ocean. And so it's very difficult to get to the Lindbergh grave. You have to take this tiny winding road on the Hana coast. One thing I forgot to put in the book, amazingly, is that the other part of this crusade is he worked with a former liberal Republican governor named Elmer Anderson. And they petitioned Richard Nixon to create a national park in Minnesota. It was finally created the year after Lindbergh's death, 1975. This is Voyager National Park. 3 years after that is when the boundary waters are protected. Right, so this is another part of the Minnesota story. Right? I think we often like to think this is one thing that Minnesota does well: green spaces, lakes, right, wetlands, preserving endangered species. Well, to some extent, Charles Lindbergh deserved some credit for that. He did use his celebrity, his connections to try to advocate for this. I think that's actually a very typical part of the Minnesota story in some ways as well. So there you have 6 themes: the frontier, immigration, religion that's more diverse than you might think, eugenics, isolationism, and environmental protection. It's kind of a motley crew of topics, but they all have some connection to Lindbergh, and I think they are all interesting aspects of this rather distinctive state's story. Okay, I managed to preserve 9 minutes. That's pretty good. I was hoping for 10, but we think so. What questions you have? I skipped over a lot of things. I dropped some hopefully tantalizing hints you might want to come back to. Maybe we have some questions on Zoom. We do have some time here if you have questions. Yeah.
I haven't had the chance to read your book, but you discuss in there the backlash Lindbergh received from his pacifist views, especially right just before the war. There's a lot of negative, feedback, and pretty serious.
Yeah, so the question is about the backlash that Lindbergh receives because of his views against intervening in the war. It's absolutely true. His wife actually gets this even more because the rest of her family thinks she is wrong and Lindbergh is wrong. She tries to stick up for her husband. She tries to stick up for what she believes, but she writes in her diary at the time, why is it that everyone I respect is opposing me? And then on my side, I find these people who seem a little bit suspicious, anti-Semitic and Nazi sympathizers, right? So I think she was probably aware of this more than he was. Charles Lindbergh, among other traits, was an incredibly stubborn person, right? I think in some ways a modest and humble person, but someone who was convinced that if he was right, he would stick to his guns and would take criticism as evidence that he was doing the right thing, right? And would not back down. At the end of his days, he never apologized, even for the Des Moines speech, right? Which even his friends in the America First Committee told him was wrong. About 6 years before his death, Charles Lindbergh edited his wartime journals. So we went through these diaries he had started keeping in 1938, 1937, 38, all the way through World War II, and they were published. It's 900 pages of journal entries. And he was keeping it because he thought, I want to, show the public record. He edits a lot of those entries. For example, the one that stuck out to me the most was not even about anti-Semitism. It wasn't really about the war. But on election night 1940, when Franklin Roosevelt won his 3rd term, and Lindbergh, by the way, hates Franklin Roosevelt with a passion. He thinks he's a dictator. He despises him. He says after Roosevelt dies, I wish I could breathe, but I can't. Anyway, election night 1940, there's a dinner party, and Lindbergh gets together with Corral and some other friends. And in Lindbergh's diary, the written one, he says, the first thing we decide is democracy can't work. We can't have a universal franchise. Too many stupid people are voting. I don't say stupid people, but I mean, and they spend the rest of the night talking about who do you take the vote away from? They talk about the feeble-minded. They talk about the Jews. But Lindbergh says first, of course, we have to start by taking away from the Negroes. Now, in 1940, only 3% of Black Americans even get to vote, and that's the first group Lindbergh wants to take the vote away from. That is not in the published wartime journals. There's a famous diary entry when he takes a ship back from France to New York in 1939. He encounters all these Jewish refugees fleeing for their lives. And if you read the wartime journals, it's very innocuous. If you read the actual journals, he talks about how disgusted he was. And he says, a few Jews are good, but too many Jews cause all sorts of problems, right?
Thanks.
This is what Anne Lindbergh means later in life when she says we probably should have paid more attention to the plight of refugees. Instead of sneering at them, right? I mean, we should have said, this tells us what the Hitler regime is like. This tells us what's really at stake in this war. But you're absolutely right. There was a huge backlash. I mean, Lindbergh kind of disappears from public sight for several years. His big comeback, by the way, is in 1953. He writes his first memoir, Spirit of St. Louis, which is really an excellent book. It's the story of the flight in 1927. And what he does that's so brilliant is for the 33 hours he's up in the air, he uses those for flashbacks. And so that's mostly where he finally writes about what it was like growing up in Minnesota. He'll see a cloud formation, and it'll make him think of something like on the farm. That's where he writes about being bored in church. That's where he writes about his thoughts about God for the first time. And so he kind of rehabilitates himself. They make a movie about it with Jimmy Stewart. It's not very good. And then kind of the last years was like environmental protection. Some people during Vietnam kind of re-embrace him, say, maybe he got some points. Maybe the US is too interventionist around the world. But also he inspires the space race. Right, he's actually there at the launch of Apollo 11, talking to Alan Shepard. He's at a dinner party with Neil Armstrong later that year. He actually met John Glenn in the South Pacific in 1944. Like, so all the astronauts love Lindbergh. Lindbergh. And so his kind of career comes back at the end, but for a while there, he really was tarred as this Nazi sympathizer. And now that's kind of coming back, right? Just a few weeks ago, there's a school in Madison, Wisconsin. It's deciding to take away the Lindbergh name. It happened a couple of years ago in Hopkins, Minnesota. The gymnasium was renamed. And it's actually becoming more and more common. Lindbergh Terminal was Terminal 1, right, at MSP. Yeah, that was a very long-winded answer. Other questions?
Why was his public persona so damaged by his infant son's murder and kidnapping?
Yeah, why is his persona not damaged by his son's kidnapping and murder? I'd say that wasn't immediately what happened, right? There was an outpouring of sympathy. People hold prayer vigils for the Lindberghs. I think what does happen is the press attention is so intense that Lindbergh probably, understandably cracks under it and really gets angry, lashes out, and then he leaves for 3 years. They live in Europe. They live in England, and then in really a rural part of Brittany, France, and get away from Americans for a while. And at that point, there's some backlash against him. Like, what are you doing leaving your country in this moment of Great Depression and war coming? There is also, I left this out of the book, but I'll say it now, like there are conspiracy theories around Charles Lindbergh and his son. There are people, including a historian I read in graduate school, who firmly believe that Charles Lindbergh killed his own son, right? Arranged the whole thing. And the theory is that Charles Lindbergh Jr. had some sort of birth deformity and his eugenicist father could not stand having a disabled child, right? That's the conspiracy theory. I didn't find any evidence of it. All that stands out to me is Charles Lindbergh says nothing about it, hardly. In this posthumous autobiography, it takes like a page and a half. There's no emotion whatsoever. It's amazing to read Anne Lindbergh's diaries from this time. She's just devastated by this. She spends the rest of her life reading this. And she watches her husband and she tells herself, well, this must be a stoic Nordic kind of thing, right? Minnesota Scandinavians, right? They keep their feelings to themselves. One way or another, it's very strange, right? He does not write about it. He doesn't reveal his feelings to his wife. It is, I think, hard to understand. But I also want to admit people grieve in different sorts of ways, right? Not everyone grieves gushingly. I mean, some people grieve by shutting it all down. And so I don't know what to make of it. One thing you'll notice about my book is I say probably less about the kidnapping than almost anyone who's ever written a Lindbergh biography before, which is not a big part of my interest. And I'm trying to steer clear of some of the conspiratorial stuff for fun. I shared it. Yeah.
Several years ago, I read a book called The Airman and the Carpenter. You probably read it or know of it. Anyway, the theme of the book is that Bruno Hoffman was not the kidnapper. What's your opinion on that?
Well, it's Bruno Hoffman, the kidnapper. I have no opinion. I'm sorry. I know true crime is a big part of the Lindbergh story. I've watched a few of the movies. I don't actually have a lot of interest in this.
Yeah, a lot of pretty compelling evidence in that book. It
Yeah,
really makes you wonder.
it is. I mean, I will say, like historically, there's all sorts of debate about was it a fair trial? Was it circumstantial evidence? Was he framed? Was it a fair investigation? That is undoubtedly true. He was not well represented at the trial. He was a German immigrant, right? Like there are all sorts of factors there that.
Trial is a circus.
Yeah, so it's understandable why people still question whether he was actually guilty. Yeah, that's probably as much as I can say about that.
Good question. It seems based on the presentation, maybe I'm off base here, but like after the war, he seemed to change his tune on certain things. Why do you suppose that was?
To some extent, yeah. Does he change his tune on things after the war? To some extent, I think he does rethink. I think you have to call it white supremacy.
Yeah.
Now he still alludes to it at times. If you read his posthumous autobiography, he does talk about things like racial mixing. But his children insist that he was very enlightened and tolerant. So his youngest child is named Reeve Lindbergh. She was born in 1945, right at the end of the war, much younger than the rest of her siblings. She's written multiple memoirs. One of them is on your handout. And she talks about listening to her father's Des Moines speech and crying. And she could not understand who this person was because it was not the person who had raised her. She remembered getting to college and people would find out who she was and they'd say, oh, you're the child of that fascist, right? And she did not understand what they were talking about. So I did try to bear that in mind to some extent. Like clearly there's a disconnect here, which, people are complicated and people are dissonant and not all our pieces of our life fit together. It does make me wonder, whether that experience of, you couldn't believe how American soldiers treated the Japanese. He was just utterly disgusted with the way American soldiers would kill Japanese prisoners, defame Japanese dead. Like he really started to rethink, wait a minute, who's the superior civilization here? Why do we assume that Asian people are somehow less human or less civilized? So like, I think there was a kind of rethinking after the war. And partly he becomes basically a writer. Most of the rest of his life is spent kind of reflecting and writing about it and like pondering all these things. And he never really settles some of it, but some of it I think he does rethink to some extent. Yes.
Do you think Lindbergh was favorably disposed or sort of supportive of the Nazi Party in Germany?
Was Lindbergh favorably disposed towards the Nazis or supportive? I think yes, to some extent. Charles Lindbergh pays 3 trips to Nazi Germany. It was at the request of the United States government. A military attaché actually named Truman Smith asked him to go visit different European countries. He goes to the Soviet Union twice, he goes to France to study air forces. Right? The US is getting ready for a war. They want to know just how strong are these air forces. And the Germans put on a really good display for Lindbergh and convince him that their air force is much stronger than it actually was. And that's often true. One historian estimates that the Americans were like 10 times off in their estimate of German air strength, right? It was partly because Lindbergh inflated the numbers. Most infamously, in 1938, Charles Lindbergh visits and he gets a medal from Hermann Goering. Now, he doesn't seem to have known that this was going to happen. And he later said he just wanted to be polite, so he said thank you, and he kept it. And again, it was one of these places where his wife said, you maybe shouldn't have done that, because instantly in the papers, now you start getting articles about the fascist Charles Lindbergh and the Nazi sympathizer Charles Lindbergh. But there's more to it. Like Lindbergh was ready to move to Berlin in 1938. In fact, the only reason he didn't is word broke of Kristallnacht, November 10th, 1938. It's a pogrom that burned down synagogues, smashed the glass of Jewish businesses. Tens of thousands of Jews were sent to concentration camps. And Lindbergh writes in his diary, why are the Germans always doing this? Right? Why? I mean, like he thinks they do have a Jewish problem. He calls it, but he's like, oh, that's too chaotic. I probably shouldn't go there after all. Right? Here again, like he's so stubborn, he will never admit that he did something wrong. Like to the very end, he will always say, well, I was probably right after all. Right? And it doesn't, I think, help him. So if any of my students know who Charles Lindbergh is, it's because they watched the HBO series. Have any of you seen this? It's based on a Philip Roth book that imagines a world in which Charles Lindbergh runs for president. It's called Plot Against America. So Charles Lindbergh runs for president, beats Franklin Roosevelt in 1940, and as president gradually ushers the United States into a kind of fascist system where Jews get rounded up. Now, if you actually read the book, it's mostly Philip Roth imagining a young boy named Philip Roth growing up in a Jewish neighborhood. But it does play on this idea that Lindbergh secretly was a Nazi. Franklin Roosevelt certainly thought he was a Nazi. And they took away his army because they didn't trust him. Yeah, I think you can push that too far. Right? I mean, I don't know. I think there's some sympathy for what the Nazis were doing. I'll say this will be the last thing. In 1939, when Lindbergh comes back from Europe to start arguing against the US joining the war, he gives radio addresses, but he also writes an article for Reader's Digest that's published in November of 1939. And it's called Aviation, Geography, and Race, I think. Remember that? And so it makes many arguments for why the US should not fight a war against Nazi Germany. And the final argument is that we should not be getting involved in what was a European civil war, a family of nations that are just having a disagreement. If anything, Lindbergh writes in 1939, we should build what he calls a Western wall of race and arms against the Asiatic threat, which means communism and probably China and Japan. And he talks about what if we had like American industry and German Air Force and the French Army and the British Navy all bound together against this threat, right? So to that extent, that is sympathy with Nazi Germany, right? He did feel like they're not a real enemy, the communists are, and the Asians are, right? And in that sense, I guess that is kind of sympathy for Hitler. It is 8:05. I'm perfectly happy to keep talking about Charles Lindbergh, but I think we advertised like an hour-long talk, so I don't want to keep you too long on such a nice. Thank you. Thank you for coming here soon. If you are interested, I had 6 books left in my box at home. They're available for sale up here. Otherwise, you can certainly pick them up online easily as well. But I appreciate getting to talk about Lindbergh and Minnesota history. Have a great rest of the day.